Good evening and welcome to Insight. On this episode, we will be discussing Bolivia and events in Latin America with former Bolivian President Evo Morales. But first, let's take a look at this brief analysis.
Latin America has witnessed the rise of a number of popular, left-leaning, anti-US governments in the last decades that are fundamentally changing the political, social, and economic power relations in their respective countries and transforming Latin America into an independent global actor who is no longer the so-called US backyard as in previous eras. Among the changes enacted by these popular governments, the changes that have occurred in Bolivia over the last 2 decades, the majority of which occurred during the presidential terms of Evo Morales from 2006 to 2019, have arguably been the most significant. In the past, Bolivia was a country in which a small, closed, conservative elite of European descent ruled over a large majority of the population of varied indigenous backgrounds. During the Cold War, the US staged coups d'états and backed repressive military dictators, particularly as reforming elements were gaining a foothold among the majority of the poor indigenous population in the 1950s and 1960s. It was in Bolivia where Che Guevara saw the most potential for a new revolution in Latin America following the Cuban Revolution, and it was here where he was killed by the US-backed Bolivian military of that time. Historically, and over the centuries, silver and tin were mined in this region, and later on, oil and gas reserves were discovered and exploited. And most recently, the vast lithium reserves of Bolivia have caught the attention of the world-devouring Western oligarchy and governments. An issue related closely to the system of US-backed military rule and oppression during the Cold War is the issue of coca leaf production and cocaine smuggling in that era in Bolivia. As in many other countries, the US security services would use drug smuggling to finance their own mischief and to finance the continued rule of various generals and colonels, all in the name of fighting the spread of communism. It is here, at the nexus between the indigenous cultivation of the coca plant, which was used medicinally and culturally for centuries by the populations of the region, and the transformation of these leaves into the lethal drug of cocaine, that we see the beginning of the uprising of the Bolivian people. In the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, and with the excuse of fighting a war on drugs, a massive new security bureaucracy and subsidy program for the military-industrial prison complex by the name of the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, was formed. In this context, the US began spraying the coca leaf plantations in Bolivia with complete disregard for the consequences this would have for the indigenous growers and the indigenous culture of Bolivia. It is here that we see the rise of the movement to protect the rights of the coca leaf farmers that marks the beginning of the political struggle of indigenous leaders such as Evo Morales, and it forms one of the foundations of the movement for socialism, which is the popular social and political movement that was able to win the presidential elections in 2006. Bolivia transformed itself from a republic led by a small elite into a plurinational state that has opened up the political process for everyone and has had an impressive record of economic growth combined with impressive social and educational development and a very significant reduction in poverty rates compared to previous decades. In 2019, the popular movement of the Bolivian people was even able to reverse a US-backed coup attempt which was supported by a certain electric car manufacturing US billionaire. The movement for socialism was able to again win the elections following the coup, this time with the leadership of current President Luis Arce. The elected government was later able to arrest and imprison the ringleaders of the coup, allowing Evo Morales and other senior figures to return to Bolivia after they sought exile in other countries during the short-lived coup d'état regime. With continued socio-economic development domestically and expanding relations with countries from around the world, including Iran, with whom close relations were established in the early 21st century, Bolivia looks to be entering a new era in its history. An era not characterized by colonial oppression nor the repressive rule of US-backed strongmen, but rather an era where the indigenous population has taken the responsibility of ruling and creating welfare for the majority of the population into their own hands. The United States and the old power elites are not happy about this successful model and example that the Bolivian people have presented to the world, and they will make all efforts to roll back the achievements and the global independence of the Bolivian people for the foreseeable future. And so the struggle of the Bolivian people for national liberation and a just, inclusive society will continue based on the solid foundations and achievements they made over the last 2 decades.
Evo Morales, leader of the Movement for Socialism and former president of Bolivia, thank you so much for joining us on Insight. I think this is a good opportunity for us to give some insight, explain for the audience who are probably not familiar with the historic background and some of the underlying issues that are related to Bolivia and Latin America in general. It's an opportunity for us to maybe give that insight to the audience. I think everybody realizes whether they agree with what has happened in the world and in Bolivia in terms of the social changes, but everybody agrees that there is a profound social change and revolution that happened in Bolivia in the last 20, 30 years. That the Bolivia of today, and particularly the Bolivia before your terms in the presidency and the Bolivia after it, are very different countries and very different societies, that there was a profound change that happened. So I would like to focus our conversation on that, but before we get into that, it's maybe good to give a little bit of the historical background of Bolivia before these changes happened. Maybe a lot of people are not familiar with what the situation, the reality on the ground for the average Bolivian was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So I would like to ask you to please, if you could, please describe for our audience, especially the younger ones, those maybe born in the 21st century, in the 1990s, please tell us about the Bolivia that you were born into, in terms of the politics, the society, the culture, the economics.
Well, I have to inform you via this communication channel about the colony from 1492 to 1825. In 1492, with the European invasion and the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the Americas. In 1825 was the era of the foundation of the Republic of Bolivia. During that time, the indigenous population composed of more than 30 nations that were exterminated. For some people, civilization arrived, but for others, it was a conquest, an invasion of our territories. An invasion that almost exterminated the indigenous people, and that killing was to try to steal our natural resources. After the foundation of the Republic, the hatred, racism, and discrimination of the indigenous people was not over. They are the original and absolute owners of these noble lands. They are the owners of its natural resources. However, with the continuation of the colonialist policies, the looting continued. After so many years, more than 500 years, our movement for socialism, based on socialism, decided to free our people. I would say that this political movement is one of a kind in the world. They were threatening us, we were hated, marginalized, politically oppressed, culturally marginalized, and economically exploited. We decided to create a political movement for liberation, not only politically, socially, and culturally, but also economically. We are the heirs of anti-imperialism. Our ancestors resisted European colonization since 1492. We are their heirs. We are against military bases of the US in our country. We are against the neoliberal policies in our region because they are still looting our resources, privatizing water, energy, communications, and education. For the first time, this movement was born to guarantee this liberation. That's our history. In a short time, 14 years ago, we could prove that our country, Bolivia, has a future. Some statistics. Since the foundation of the Republic in 1825 to 2005, we had a GDP of $9 billion. After that, till 2019, we had $42 billion of GDP. You can see the difference. We should also say that in 2005, before I became president, the movement for socialism, $600 million were invested in the public sector. But in the last 4 years of our government, till 2019, we invested more than $7 billion. So, I was summarizing the part of the colonial era, and I was also saying that our political movement is one of a kind, because we changed that fight for the election battle with a program coming from the people, created by the people, with ideologies and principles from our ancestors. That's why we could change our beloved Bolivia.
Well, Mr. President, the cultural aspect was very important, that it wasn't simply about, maybe following or copying some other plan or some other model from another place, that you were really striving to create an indigenous Bolivian model for development, taking into consideration the history and the culture, the native culture that exists in Bolivia and has existed for thousands of years. So I would like to ask you maybe, and again, I want to maybe emphasize for our viewers who are not familiar, the Bolivia that you were born into in the time of the Cold War was one of oppression, of a military dictatorship, where there was a severe discrimination. There was these governments who were completely in the hand of the Americans. And of course, at the time of the Spanish, there was silver, then we had tin, and now we have lithium, there's natural gas. So what I want to ask you is, if you could please explain, especially for the younger audience and those who might be in a similar situation as you were 30, 40 years ago, how is it possible that you were able to create this people's revolution with basically no resources? That there wasn't internet at that time. There was none of the things that we have today. Please give us a little insight into how is it possible for you to create this movement with very little resources and with people who are from the lowest level of society at that time.
Well, I would say that why do we have this liberation idea, this social, political and economic liberation of the country? It's a feeling because we were suffering, and this feeling created a thought, the idea of liberation, ideas of how to create the basis for the liberation of the country. That's why I was saying that our political movement for socialism was one of a kind in the world, because it was formed by the lower classes of the society and those marginalized people. In a short time, they gained hope. In order to make this movement stronger, of course, resources are necessary, but the people are the most important factor. The unity of the people and the social movements, the electoral unity. I remember perfectly when for the first time I became president, what the ambassador of the US to Bolivia, Manuel Roja, used to say: "Don't vote for Evo Morales. He is the Taliban of the coca. Don't vote for Evo Morales. If Evo Morales becomes president, we are not going to help you or invest in the social sector." Now, what was the public investment in 2005? $600 million. But we had a program for more than $8 billion, and we could invest more than $7 billion. He said nobody is going to cooperate with us if he becomes president. Many have cooperated with us. Besides, the IADB has cancelled more than $500 million to Bolivia. We have negotiated with them. Japan, more than $500 million. Spain, $300 million. We invested in education. They are still cooperating with us. What they wanted to do was to scare us, scare the Bolivian people, but they couldn't do it. In the political sector, we could refound Bolivia, and in the social sector, we have distributed the resources of our country properly for everybody. In the social sector, after 180 years of the foundation of Bolivia, the lower classes of the society received our help, from that colonial state to the plurinational state that we have now, the unity in the diversity of the different nations of our country. the aggressions coming from imperialism. I'm still convinced that capitalism and neoliberalism are the worst enemies of the unity of our people. About nationalization, we could do it with our national resources with strategic companies. This is in the economic sector. In the social sector, the distribution of the wealth of our country with our new policies. Before the state was never present, there were no programs. Of course, we are still struggling to finish this job. This experience we have had, the resistance you can see, made possible that the indigenous people, together with all social sectors in the country, the patriots, could become free. We made it real, the liberation of the country. This is a very small experience of Bolivia.
Well, Mr. President, because we don't have a lot of time, I want to move now to the events that happened later on in the latter part of your presidency. And some would, of course, call it a coup d'etat that occurred. Maybe the Americans and those elites, those older former elites in Bolivia, maybe felt that they were basically losing their own definition of what Bolivia was. Their world was changing around them, and so they, in what was very clearly a plan that was being steered by the Americans, caused trouble. We've had similar experiences in Iran. We had these events happening during elections in Iran. And in fact, I would like to say that what you mentioned in terms of having this revolution happening from the bottom up was a very similar experience that happened in Iran. That's why we also see that during your presidency there was a very good, close relations with Iran, and still is to this day. And of course, one of the first things that the coup d'etat government did was they broke diplomatic relations with Iran as a symbol of their support for America. So if you could please, we pretty much know what happened in the coup d'etat, but I think the very interesting story is how the Bolivian people were able to reverse this coup d'etat in a, once again, a democratic rebellion, as you mentioned. We had various billionaires who are very interested in lithium tweeting at that time that, you know, we can coup d'etat any country we like. And then a couple months later, we see that the Bolivian people were able to reverse that coup d'etat. So if you could please tell us about that a little bit, and then we can move on to talk about relations between Iran and Bolivia, and maybe the future of Bolivia and Latin America in this changing world order that we're experiencing. So if you could please first tell us, how was it possible that the Bolivian people were able to reverse this coup d'etat supported by the Americans?
Don't worry, I have cancelled my trip in order to stay longer. The coup d'etat, I would say that there are two very important elements or factors. Unfortunately, some people from Bolivia, especially those related to imperialism, do not accept that the indigenous people can govern, can become a president. They don't accept that. Some academics that represent those racist people say we have studied to govern and dominate the indigenous people. But we have shown after 14 years how to fight for equality and the sovereignty of the country. We have made a plurinational state in unity and the diversity of the country. So with this idea of not accepting that indigenous people can rule a country, they create this coup d'etat. Economic policies come from the people, so when we could show that in Bolivia it's possible to have another country with an economic program to show them that imperialism, capitalism or neoliberalism can be changed and has not solved any problem. We are still poor and they are looting the country, discriminating, humiliating people. The majority is poor. The policies of neoliberalism are not having results. They don't have any results. In 6 years, we were the first in economic growth in South America. When I became president, we were the last country in South America. In the whole continent, we were before the last one. After I became president, with the help of the people, Bolivia was first in economic growth. Third factor is especially the lithium that we have in our country. After we nationalized, we had decided to industrialize our national resources, something that we have done and are still doing, especially with lithium. The West doesn't accept that South Americans, especially Bolivia, can have an added value for our national resources. That's in the case of lithium. The owner of Tesla, that transnational company, said on social networks, "We are going to create wars everywhere we want." And he also said, "You have to deal with it." It was financed by the US, the coup d'etat, and also by some other Latin American countries, even England, and we know that after 3 years of this coup d'etat. This coup d'etat was because of the lithium. Maybe you heard 2 weeks ago that the US Southern Command said they were worried about the lithium problem. He said South America is like a neighborhood to the US. We used to be the backyard of the US, but now we are a neighborhood. So with our policy, we have assured the sovereignty and political and economic independence. We closed the DEA office in our country. The USA, we also told them to leave the country. We are the heirs of our ancestors, the fighters for our freedom. However, the police and the army, I'm sorry to say this, but they betrayed us. But the consciousness of the people was so strong in front of the US policy that they supported our political movement, and we won that fight. We won the elections thanks to the people. You might remember that the Bolivian minister who traveled to the US before the elections said from there that we are going to give the presidency in Bolivia but not to the movement for socialism. All these American policies have come to an end in Bolivia. The movement for socialism is ruling the country. Evo is in Bolivia alive. The Bolivian people are still fighting. At that time, I decided how to leave Bolivia to avoid the murdering of the people, and we were not wrong. It was a good decision. After a while, we could recover our democracy, and the movement for socialism is ruling the country.
That's right, Mr. President. I think maybe this is a very interesting case in history, a very unique case in history, where you had these kind of turmoil, but the leaders, in this case you, many people were thinking that you might want to cling on to power in some way that was going to endanger the nation or try to turn this into a personal matter, but you made a very important strategic decision, which if we look back at history now, it was one that basically saved the nation and was allowed this process to continue because that government had not really come into power in a correct manner. So I would like to, because you talked about Bolivia's independent foreign policy, I would like to talk a little bit about ALBA. I would like to talk a little bit about this idea that Latin America is entering into a new era in its history, where, as you said, it is no longer the backyard, front yard, whatever yard the Americans want to name it, that it is sovereign and independent, establishing relations with whatever countries it wants to, whether it's Iran, whether it's China, Russia. And so if you could please tell us a little bit about Bolivia's foreign policy and its place in this changing global order that we're witnessing with the rise of new powers, especially in Asia, and how you see the future of Bolivia and Latin America in this changing world order.
The US is not a superpower anymore. It's not controlling South America anymore. Why are they not an economic superpower? Well, right now they have inflation and economic problems. They have provoked this conflict between Russia and Ukraine with NATO. Now they are having economic problems. It's a bit ridiculous to see that the US president is negotiating with Maduro to buy oil. This is something that should be evaluated, or we should ask ourselves what's going on. In 1940, if I'm not mistaken, 40% of the world's GDP was from the USA. 40 to 50 years ago, it was more than 40%. Now it's only 15% of the world's GDP. That's why we are saying it's not an economic superpower anymore. In South America, it's losing its power. The last summit of the Americas took place in the USA without Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua. Several countries joined them in this exclusion of 3 Latin American countries and didn't go to the summit. However, in this summit, the countries that participated said the truth. 22 countries and 22 speeches. 20 of them were asking, where is Cuba? Where is Venezuela? Where is Nicaragua? Why are they not here? They were brave. Some presidents, they were very brave, and told them in their own house, in the US, there is no democracy in the US, they invade other countries, they are not democratic. So I used to say before that it was a bit scary to be excluded from the OAS. During the summits of the Americas, I used to introduce myself as a communist and a socialist. Tell me to leave this organization, but they have never done it. We know that this is a strong instrument from the US to control South America and the Caribbean. Being expelled from the OAS is a luxury today. It's an honor. This organization is declining. Because of the OAS, the US is controlling South America. They are questioning us. According to the Republican Senator Cruz, the left wing in South America has created unsafety for the US. That's why the US is trying to provoke these coups d'etats for the countries that are economically, socially and politically free. They just want to impose their ideas. That's why they create these coups d'etats or install military bases. That's why I say it's a democratic rebellion in Latin America. Of course, we have our differences as political parties, governments, left-wing governments. Some of them are left-wings, communist, socialist and humanistic, but we are all revolutionary and we have to be anti-imperialist. In Bolivia, we guaranteed our sovereignty, our independence, the dignity and the freedom of the people. We closed the military base of the USA. We had an anti-capitalist program by nationalizing our resources. Some other left-wing presidents have problems doing this in their countries. They cannot close military bases in their countries. Every country has its own peculiarities and experiences. Some of them have struggled in the elections. They fight for social changes, but also to be a revolutionary person, you have to be an anti-imperialist person. We have done it. That's why Bolivia has changed. We are going the right way. There are other presidents and governments that are our allies. We work with them. They are strategic allies. Our hope is to increase this alliance with China, Russia, Iran, also with Venezuela, Cuba or Nicaragua. We have to create these strategic alliances for our own life and for humanity. We need to have policies based on solidarity. It's a great program that the movement for socialism has a political movement, but we also have a lot of people. For now, we have to defend our revolution in Bolivia, also known as a changing process. We have to fight for the Lucho and David, our president and vice president. In my experience, I have to say that when people are united, it's possible to make these changes, these great changes, these social, political, cultural and economic changes. We have the responsibility to guarantee independence in science and technology. We have to be independent. I had the plan to do it before the coup d'etat, to create a program for science and technology. There is no need to be a scientist, a politician can do it. With the new generations, with our young people, the scientists, they are going to make it true. This independence in science and technology. I trust the young people in our beloved Bolivia.
Mr. President, you mentioned this science and technology. Of course, that's been also the experience in Iran. We've had this almost, we could say, miraculous revolution, this technological and scientific revolution in Iran after the revolution, when the people were allowed to develop themselves. So this is something that has happened in a place like Iran as well, and very likely to happen in Bolivia if you can do that. Before I continue with Latin America, because you mentioned some very interesting trends that are happening, I would like to get your opinion later on about Colombia, what happened there, and what happened in Chile, two countries that were traditionally very conservative and did not and have recently voted for left-wing governments. But before that, I want to just quickly address something that you mentioned in terms of the work that is being done currently with the current president and the current government. You know, the people who are always trying to look for problems and trying to cause disunity and cause problems within the people are somehow portraying the situation where there's maybe problems between Evo Morales and the leadership that currently exists, that there are maybe issues relating to what has happened. So I would like to ask you if you could please, this is a good opportunity to maybe talk about this in a more clear fashion. What is your position on this government? Is your support complete and absolute? Are you planning to run again? Or is this something that is just made up by the enemies of this revolution that has happened in Bolivia?
First of all, 200 years ago in all Latin America, there were fights for independence of the republics and for the liberation of the continent. In Bolivia in 1825, a republic was founded almost 200 years ago. It was not real independence, but what we did was real, the freedom of our people, the fighters. After 200 years, almost 200 years, again we have new fighters like Pepe Mujica, Daniel Ortega, Dilma Rousseff and Petro. In Bolivia, Alvaro Garcia Linera was prosecuted and jailed. After that, the people realized that they had to support those fighters. Some of them were presidents, some were ex-presidents, like Dilma or Mujica. Daniel Ortega was a fighter. He was the last fighter who won the elections democratically in his country. Those who took up arms at that time were not wrong, because that Western democracy was imported. It was not real. Those colonial states never solved our problems. We had some states without classes, states that were absent. They were fake, failed states. They were under the pressure of imperialism. The monetary fund was controlling those states. No one was investing in our countries. That's our history. That's our fight with different models. And there is when we have political movements. I was listening to you talking about the Islamic Revolution, the Cuban revolutions, but we are not going to win elections only with the indigenous people. We are having meetings. There are some difficulties, we have good ideas and good results. Let me repeat it again. The fight still goes on and it will continue as long as imperialism and capitalism exist. But if we are together, we will win. We will get the victory. The people have to be united. If we are with the people, we are going the right way. We are not in power for ambition. We do not have any ambition. In other countries, it's the same, especially countries that are free now. We have the obligation to defend our countries and to defend Lucho and David, the president and vice president. Now we have elections. About the elections, our political movement and social movements will decide how to choose and who are we going to choose the new representatives for the parliament and the president and the vice president for our country. In my opinion, it's very important to never give up on our principles, on our values, and fight for our principles, for our ideas. It's like a revolution inside a revolution. Second, as social movements and political movements, we have to work and present a program to make a second democratic and cultural revolution. In 2005, we won the elections. In the political sector, we have the refoundation of the republic. And in the social sector, with the distribution of the resources of the country. And in the economic sector, with the industrialization of the resources. But we are never going to import foreign policies. Our people are going to create this program and make this program true for a second revolution.
Very good, Mr. President. So I want to talk about this very interesting things that have happened now in Latin America, because you know the media that is dominated by the Western media, the public opinion that they try to create is that they always paint a very negative picture of the future. So we had recently the victory of the first left-wing president in Colombia, a very important historic event in the history of Colombia, which usually for almost 70 years had very conservative governments and usually allied with the United States very closely. We also had the victory of the left in Chile, with all the history that we have in Chile in terms of the coup d'etat and the dictatorship that we had there. So I would like to ask you to please give us a vision for the future of Latin America, with given all these things that are happening, the things that you mentioned in terms of the rising powers like China, Russia, Iran, the different alliances that are creating. Give us an idea of how you see Latin America in 10, 15, 20 years, how it's going to be.
There is no Pacific Alliance. Why am I talking about this? Well, in 2010, the US tried to recover this idea of free trade for the Americas. Fidel Castro, Hugo, and Lula talked about this in a summit in Argentina. After that, they tried to create this Pacific Alliance in order to oppose UNASUR, ALBA, and then they created this group of Lima that was composed of Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Spain. Now this group doesn't exist anymore. There was a democratic rebellion. I had some differences with other presidents. They are left-wing presidents, but we have our differences because in order to make changes, you have to be anti-imperialist. We have made very important progress, and I think that is going to continue. I'm almost sure that on January the 1st next year, Lula is going to be the president of Brazil. We are seeing how to organize us and how to be united. Next year, also in Paraguay, there will be some changes, although there are some other countries that depend on who is a candidate. But also, some policies imposed by the North and from the exterior are trying to defeat us. Imperialism is always fighting, is always creating programs to affect us, to divide us economically, trying to dominate our countries and loot our natural resources. That's why we don't think in America is for Americas. We are against the Cold War, the terror. We are saying that America is a plurinational continent and the idea of America for the Americans will come to an end. In that context, I hope that new events will take place in our continent. To summarize, we have to strengthen UNASUR, a CELAC or Community of Latin America and Caribbean States. CELAC is the best organization to take the place of the OAS because the Group of Lima was only defending the interest of North American imperialism.
Mr. President, we've come to the end of our time. I have one last question regarding soccer and your insight into these affairs. You are, of course, a soccer enthusiast, and you've been playing soccer since you were very young. As you know, unfortunately, Bolivia did not make it this year to the World Cup, but Iran is once again, single-handedly fighting the Anglo-American Empire in the World Cup. We're in the same group with England, the US, and Wales. What do you see are Iran's chances of advancing to the second stage and beating the Anglo-American Empire in the World Cup?
Iran is going to play for world peace. The Iranian team, I'm sure, is going to win and will represent all the humble people and the poor people in the world against England and the US. I wish them the best. Last week we had the Under-17 South American Championship here, and we hope that next year Iran can come and participate. They can play not only with South Americans but also from other continents. Greeting to the Iranian people, the government in Iran and the Islamic leader. I admire Iran because of that great process of liberation that you've had. Despite all threats and intimidation, Iran is an inspiration for the freedom of other countries as well as Cuba or Venezuela. Thank you very much for this interview, and you can call me anytime you want. As you said, we can talk and exchange experiences and ideas about the liberation processes.
Thank you very much. So what insight did we gain from our conversation with former Bolivian President Evo Morales? As Morales explained, Bolivia experienced a unique, peaceful, democratic, and indigenous revolution, which beyond the political, social, and economic dimensions, also had an important cultural dimension that transformed Bolivian society, particularly as it relates to the status and rights of the majority indigenous population. And Bolivia has been developing its own model of governance and development, which takes into account its indigenous culture and history. As Morales said, the US and US-backed old elites in Bolivia didn't want an indigenous person to rule, and some still don't want that, and it seems they can't handle the fact that indigenous people are now ruling the country, and this is very significant in the context of Bolivian history. Bolivia has experienced significant socio-economic development and poverty reduction in the last decade. And with its many natural resources, it appears that its growth and development will continue into the foreseeable future. In the international arena, Bolivia is conducting an independent foreign policy, with regional cooperation in South America being the main focus, as well as establishing and maintaining good relations with nations from around the world, including Iran, with whom Bolivia has been able to establish a very close relation. The US and the old power structures in Bolivia are reluctant to accept these fundamental transformations. And as they attempted in the coup in 2019, they are still scheming to reverse the path that Bolivia has taken in recent years. Capable political leaders such as Evo Morales are always an important factor in the national awakening and liberation struggles of a nation. But historical experiences, such as the case of Iran after the Islamic Revolution, show Whenever a people conduct a revolution themselves, and they feel the nation belongs to them, then they will continue on the path of liberation, despite the difficulties on this path. It appears that the Bolivian people have had a similar experience, and they will continue on this path no matter what evil schemes the U.S. and its servants in the region are planning for Bolivia.